I mean by modesty is what parts of and how much of the body needs to be covered in order to be modest. What is nakedness? And questions like that. I'm not talking about jewelry, modesty of apparel in terms of simplicity or issues like that. Okay. The key verse that we'll look at is in 1 Timothy, where Paul says, I will that women adorn themselves in modest apparel. Okay, so I'll get us started here. And so we'll just ask the question, what is modesty? What questions do you have about this topic? Okay. What about shorts? Okay. Yes.
What is the whole deal about like having like ripped shirts?
What about sleeve lengths? Okay.
Is a slit appropriate?
Okay. What about splits or slits in skirts? Okay. I had someone in the other class ask if the skirt comes below the knee and the split doesn't go above the knee, is a problem.
Is modesty applied to men as well as women? Because in 1 Timothy talks about it.
Okay. 1 Timothy focuses. It's true. Okay. Question. Next.
What about sports, you know? Like you wear shorts and bodyguards for sports and stuff.
Shorts, tank tops. Water skiing. Snorkeling. Skin diving. Etc. Okay, yeah, next question is?
Who or what verse defines what where modesty, how all these things that are being listed are modest or not modest?
Okay, who defines what modesty is? Where does the Bible talk about this? These things. Does that capture your question? Okay. Next. I see people talking.
What's the cutoff between being modest and being too?
Being too.
What's the cutoff between being modest and being too rebellious?
Oh, Sarah. So, in other words, what are the boundary lines between modesty and immodesty? Is that okay? Next.
How about the ages? Like for young toddlers, is it
Okay,
the same
what
as
about
for adults?
age distinctions for modesty? Toddlers, babies for that matter. Okay. Next.
I'm not sure how the forming of this, but is there a distinct, should clothes be worn in such ways so as to determine the sex, but not be immodest?
Okay. A way in which it would not determine the sex would be to be a bag. Basically, a barrel. Okay.
Oh.
What about shoes and sandals?
Okay, yeah, there we go. What about shoes and sandals? Usually people are talking about open-toed shoes when they ask this question, right? Yes.
Why are hose considered modest apparel?
Okay, what's up with hose?
What's up with hosiery? Let's put it that way.
Okay, why are hose considered modest apparel? That one always comes up. Okay. I think the other class said nylons.
Yes.
We'll go with that term. All right. Next. Consider modest. Let's keep it modest in there.
That's what I was trying to find.
Okay, next. Are there any, okay, what about,
Hair?
we've got some different countries represented here. I'd be interested in hearing if there are any unique modesty questions that come from your country. Hi.
Like, I don't know, like, I guess this has something to do with like cutting, but my mom came up here and she saw like these Poland, supposed to be Poland hens, I don't know, but they wore like goes, I don't know whether they're very tight fitting pants, I guess, and under their dresses when it's cold, and she was saying, oh, they're wearing pants and stuff. I was like, I don't know.
Good. So is this a modesty problem?
Also, some people wear them like under a short skirt just because of style and stuff too.
Okay. We're talking spandex here. Under a, how short is the short skirt? Are we talking mini skirt or are we talking
No,
knee length?
like knee length with
Okay. Okay. Next.
I have a question. This would pertain, I guess, like eventually to my wife. At what point?
Whoever she may be.
Yeah. At what point is the distinction of sexes appropriate in the clothes you wear? Like God made her with a body. At what point does she be careful in what she wears, and at what point is she a woman? I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, is that different than the question about
It's kind of like what I was.
should clothes be worn in such a way as to reflect the sex of the person who's wearing the clothing? Okay. Was there something unique to marriage that you were thinking about? But you're thinking more in terms of the guidance that you would provide
For my wife.
for a wife, yes. Okay. let's ask it this way.
I'm not sure where, I could mention that, to keep the torso covered. And I'm
Okay.
wondering, you'll probably cover that, what that constitutes.
Okay. Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? I guess this isn't wrapping. It's supposed to be wrapping. What's the deal with that? Maybe it only wraps when I put it on the Come on. Scroll. Okay, any other questions? Going once? No other questions? All right. So I'll save those questions as coming from this class. All right, so let's begin with this lecture with a definition of modesty. I'll defend the definition as we go through the course of the lectures, but here's the definition that I think best reflects the biblical data. Modesty is first a heart attitude, and second, an expression of that heart attitude in demeanor, deportment, and dress, if you want to be alliterative, or clothing. Okay? It starts in the heart, and the outside is not just dress, it also involves demeanor. That's your facial expression, your overall body posture, deportment, how you act, and clothing. Modesty is not limited to the concept of clothing. All right, so here's the key text, 1 Timothy, chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Paul in the King James says, "In like manner that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety." Ladies, did you think about your shamefacedness and sobriety this morning when you put on your clothes? You know what shamefacedness is. Okay, so if you don't, how can you do it if you don't know what it is? Not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. Okay, so there are 4 elements here to what Paul says a woman is supposed to do to adorn herself. The King James, modest clothing, shamefacedness, sobriety, and good works. Now, let's look at the New American Standards translation here of this passage. "Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing," whereas the King James said modest. "Modestly," whereas the King James said shamefacedness. "And discreetly," whereas the King James said sobriety. Okay, not with braided hair, gold, pearls, costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. So there are 3 key terms that we've got to get definitions for and understand as we look at what it means to obey this passage. The first term is modest, second, shamefacedness, and number 3, sobriety. The word modest, which is translated proper by the New American Standard, is the Greek word kosmio. And kosmio, by the lexicons, is defined as what is appropriate, proper, which is where the New American Standard gets its translation, well arranged or put in order. In modern English, appropriate and proper can sound situationally relative, right? It's appropriate in a classroom, it's different on the playground, but I don't think that's the focus of the word. It's not talking about situationally appropriate, it's talking about well arranged or put in order. It's talking about put together well. Okay, the verb form of this word is the word that's translated to adorn, to decorate or ornament, arrange in an orderly fashion. Okay, so proper clothing is orderly, well put together clothing. Shamefacedness, the second King James word, translated by the New American Standard modest, is the Greek word idous, and it is referring to a sense of shame or embarrassment, discomfort, or a sense of honor that hinders you from doing an unworthy act. You know, oh man, I couldn't do that. I'd be embarrassed to do that. I'd be ashamed to do that. Colloquially, I wouldn't be caught dead wearing that. It's not talking about the shame that comes from having done wrong, but rather a preventative kind of embarrassment that keeps us from doing something that would be judged inappropriate. Okay. The third word is sobriety or discreetly. Okay. And this is the word sophrosunes, and it means the practice of prudence, good judgment, moderation, or self-control. A level-headedness that produces careful living. So, we can paraphrase this verse like this. I want women to adorn or arrange themselves in the following way. With well put together, appropriate, proper clothing, in a way that reflects their sense of shame or honor, discreetly, prudently, and with good works, as is proper for a woman who claims godliness. So, in terms of our topic of modesty, this is our key word, shamefacedness. Modesty, shamefacedness, is that sense of shame or embarrassment that hinders you from doing an unworthy act. So I think we can conclude from this passage that modesty in dress is the application of an appropriate sense of shame as one of the considerations, one, not the only, but one of the considerations that governs our choice of clothing. Other considerations include color, size, taste, whether the clothes match. All of those are additional considerations. So the question is, all right, if a sense of shame or an appropriate sense of honor is supposed to govern how I dress, particularly as a woman, where does that sense of shame come from? And we want to look now at the origins of biblical modesty. We're going to look at man's condition before the fall, then we'll look at man's attempt to deal with nakedness after the fall, how God responded to man's attempt to deal with nakedness, and conclude today with why modesty is morally necessary. Okay, so starting here with Genesis 2:25, the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So God created Adam and Eve, no clothing, not ashamed. Why? Weren't they ashamed? Well, the reason is they didn't know they were naked. Okay, how do I know that? Well, whenever they ate the fruit, their eyes were opened and they knew that they were naked. As a result, they're embarrassed and ashamed, and God asks them the question, who told you that you were naked, implying that if somebody hadn't told them, they wouldn't have known. Now, as it was, somebody didn't tell them. The result of their sin changed their self-perception. I don't know how the human mind worked before the fall. Obviously, it worked differently because our minds cannot help but perceive nakedness. Okay? So, some people have suggested, things like garments of light, or, but I think we've all had the experience of not having seen something that was obvious, and then when you suddenly see it, you're like, how is it that I could not have seen that for so long? I mean, there it is, as plain as the nose on your face. So, apparently God did something to their mind that helped them not to see this. So, in response to their nakedness, they decide to make some clothes. I'm impressed with their ingenuity. They sew fig leaves together. Now, fig leaves aren't the most delicate kind of leaf, but neither are they like pieces of cardboard. So you're going to have to, they must have created some kind of plant material thread and some kind of plant material needle. And they did their best. They were ingenious. And they created what's called aprons here. They made themselves aprons. The Hebrew word for apron, hagarot, refers to that which is worn about the hips. Basically a loincloth or something like a pair of short shorts. Okay? Both the man and the woman wore these aprons of fig leaves. So their best attempt to deal with modesty did not involve clothing the upper body. I think we can conclude from this account that a sense of embarrassment is instinctive in fallen man. The minute they realized that they were naked, they tried to do something about it. They wanted to cover it. They wanted to hide it. And I think we could also say that the text indicates that they probably didn't feel like they'd done a good enough job in covering their nakedness, because when God comes looking for Adam, Adam, where art thou? I hid myself because I was naked. What do you mean, Adam? You're naked? I mean, you got fig leaf shorts on. What are you talking about? Well, apparently fig leaf shorts didn't sufficiently cover Adam for Adam's satisfaction. He continued to feel naked. Right? So, even though they did their best, I think they would have regarded their best as insufficient. Now, I just kind of add a second point here. There's no return to the innocency of Eden. Even when we're brought fully back into the image of God, all that we know about heaven is that we will wear clothes. The people that are seen in heaven by John the Revelator, people who come from heaven, they all wear clothes. So whatever it was, whether God's original intent was for Adam and Eve and their unfallen descendants to remain unclothed and unaware of their lack of clothing, or whether it was God's intent to eventually clothe them, we don't know. Okay? But we do know that we're not ever going back to Eden. Right? This thing has got a mind of its own. What's going on without me? Now, Christians aren't the only people who've asked, where did clothes come from? There is a whole discipline studying the language of clothing and clothing fashions and how clothing communicates and the history of clothing. And there are various ideas about where clothing came from. The secular ideas involve utility. For example, following the evolutionary schema, which I completely reject as unbiblical. The cavemen came out of their cave and went chasing after the lion, and they say, ooh, sharp claws. kind of rough on the skin, so we need something that protects us from sharp claws. They walk through the woods and they get scratches because of the brush, and they say, oh, that's bad, we need something to protect us. So utilitarian concerns are a common secular explanation for clothing. Other secularists have said, no, clothing really arose out of a desire to ornament the body, to be attractive to the opposite sex, or to be a display of power, status, prestige. Okay. And the idea that covering nakedness was a concern shows up as well. In fact, Alison Lurie, whom I believe to be a woman, wrote the book The Language of Clothes, and she's a secular writer. She says that in the past, sexual modesty was often proposed as the purpose of dress. The Bible tells us that this was the original reason for wearing clothes. Now, she goes on to reject that. She doesn't believe that's true. And one of the reasons she doesn't believe that's true, and others have rejected, is because secular anthropologists have found cultures where people don't wear clothes and they're not embarrassed about it. Okay, so Aboriginal clothes, often called primitive civilizations, found in various places, Africa, Papua New Guinea, South America, the Philippines. These Aboriginal cultures are often considered primitive, that is, closer to original than anything else. And they live without clothes, some of them, with apparently no sense of shame. So that proves then that shame is not a built-in characteristic to the humans, so they say. Well, I think there's a reason to reject that argument. Romans chapter 1 tells us that when people who are able to see that there is a God, that He's eternal, and that He's powerful, reject that information, what happens is they became vain in their imaginations and foolish in their hearts. Their hearts are darkened, and they begin to worship the creature instead of the Creator. So idolatry is what follows from this. And God gives them up, according to verse 24, to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. So sexual immorality follows a rejection of God. What happens then is there's further degradation, so that women change the natural use into that which is against nature, either referring to prostitution or lesbianism, and men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust one towards another. So homosexuality follows. And eventually, we find that these are people who not only know that it's wrong to do it and do it deliberately, but they, according to verse 32, have pleasure in those who do them. This becomes what is pleasurable to this society, what is appropriate. So I would describe what secular anthropologists call as primitive societies as devolved, debased, or degraded societies. Societies or cultures that have lost the knowledge of God that was originally there through creation, and as a result have had their understanding and minds darkened and devolved into a grossly unbiblical state. Paul himself talks about people who glory in their shame. Now, it's not hard to see this today, folks. All I got to do is look at our magazine covers to see what is the glory of many people in our culture. They are glorying in what God calls shameful. Question?
Is that the same reason why it's so easy to go to the beaches today and see so much people married more?
Yes, I think our culture is continuing to devolve away from a biblical understanding of what is appropriate and shameful. And in fact, later on in the in the lecture series, I'll read you some interviews conducted by World Magazine with girls who are buying bikinis and girls on the beach, and questions asked why they were wearing what they're wearing and how that made them feel and what they were trying to communicate. And I think glory in shame is an adequate description of what we'll see there. Okay, so we'll come back to that. All right. So, how did God respond to Adam and Eve's nakedness? Did he say, well, we just need to add a little bit here to the top, and fig leaf shorts and an appropriate top, and you'll be fine? No, what God does is He clothes them with coats of skins. Now, it's quite common for people to read this text and then go theological. They'll say, here is the first reference to sacrifice. God sacrificed animals to make a covering for sin. And the problem is, well, that may be true. There may have been sacrifice involved. The text doesn't say anything about sacrifice. It doesn't say anything about offering for sin. What it says is God clothed them. And it bothers me when people focus on an interpretation of the text and ignore what the text actually says. The text seems to be focusing on God's response to nakedness. I think we can conclude that fallen man's instinctive sense of shame is validated by God's first action after the curse on behalf of fallen man. God did not approve of Adam and Eve's attempt to cover their nakedness. He considered their aprons insufficient, and when He clothed them, He established His standard of modesty. Now, that means we're going to have to study what the word coat means in Hebrew. Okay? So find out what that is. But clearly the purpose of clothing is to cover nakedness. Based on our previous lecture series, I think we can conclude that whatever the nature of the clothing God made for Adam and Eve, it would have been gender distinct. Eve's clothing would have been different from Adam's clothing, and it would have been modest. It would have covered everything in a way that God thinks should be covered in the way it should be covered. All right. Now, why all this hoopla about modesty? Okay, why is modesty morally necessary? Well, 1 Timothy does address women specifically, but it is not just a women's issue. It is also a men's issue. There are 3 reasons why I believe that modesty is morally necessary. Let's start with the first. Women are attracted to men's physical appearance. We find this in Scripture, that Potiphar's wife noticed that Joseph was handsome of form and face. Okay, she noticed both his physique as well as his face. And after noticing that is when she approaches him to lie with her. Okay, so he was attractive to her. Here's the Shulamite, Song of Solomon 5, talking about her lover within the context of marriage. What does she talk about? Well, she talks about physical characteristics. His head, his hands, his mouth, his eyes, his abdomen, and so on. Okay, so the physical characteristics of her husband were attractive to her. That's not wrong, it's just a reality. The second reason I believe modesty is morally necessary is that those with unnatural desires may be attracted to the appearance of the same gender. Of course, we see this happening in Sodom, where the angels come and the homosexual men of the town gather around. But, I wish that we could ignore this, but the truth of the matter is that you have absolutely no idea who is tempted by same-sex temptations, unless they tell you. It is not wrong to be tempted by same-sex desires. It is wrong to give in to those. It's not normal to be tempted by same-sex desires. Okay? But it's not wrong. Now, in our culture where we will be, unless God grants us a revival in the broader American world, we're going to increasingly be having Corinthians coming into the church. Right? 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul says, some of you were homosexuals, the male partner, the female partner, and idolaters, fornicators, adulterers. Such were some of you, but you're washed, you're justified, you're sanctified. Well, as our culture degenerates, there will be Christians coming into the body who will be coming out of this lifestyle. And for that reason, it will become all the more important for us to be concerned about modesty within the same gender, lest we be a stumbling block to them. Does that make sense? You understanding what I'm saying here? Okay. Talk more about this later. And of course, men are strongly attracted by women's physical appearance. Some men say irresistibly attracted, but the Bible says that's not true, because 1 Corinthians 10:13, there is no temptation that takes you, such as is common to man. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above your ability to withstand. Okay? So, that promise applies to people who are walking in the light. That promise does not apply to people who are not walking in the light. You can generate desires in yourself that you can't resist. Okay, that's called addiction. But for the person who is walking in the light, they have this promise. But nonetheless, this is a strong attraction. Okay? And the Bible acknowledges it. Think about Sarah. At 80 and 90, she was such a looker that Abraham was afraid he was going to be killed because of her, so he asks her to lie about their relationship, right? She must have been some lady. Okay. She got noticed everywhere she went. Philistines noticed her. The Egyptians noticed her. Proverbs 6 says, do not desire the beauty of an adulteress in your heart, which means that adulterous women may be beautiful women. And that beauty is attractive to men, and men are told, do not desire that beauty in your heart. Matthew 5:28, Jesus says, he that looks on a woman to lust for the purpose of lusting has committed adultery with her already in his heart. He doesn't address that command to men, to women, he addresses it to men. Why? Because men are the ones most likely to be tempted by lust. Okay? Yes, sir.
This doesn't have much to do with modesty, but that verse, does that mean that because this is adultery, does that mean by means of marriage as well?
I didn't hear the last 4 words.
Does that apply to married men?
Like married men.
Oh, of course. But it's not limited to them.
Oh, that's what I meant. Because of the definition of policy. Sorry.
Yeah. No. The point is you've committed sexual sin. That's a good question. Okay. So it'd be like saying, you can lust until you're married, and once you get married, you got to quit lusting. Now, the Bible tells us that this attraction is true even of godly men. Take, for example, Job, who was declared perfect and upright, eschewing evil, staying away from all forms of evil. But in Job 31, he says, I've made a covenant with my eyes that I will not look upon a maid. So here, a man that God calls perfect realized the necessity of guarding himself against lust through the eye gate. Here's David, a man who begins as a man after God's own heart. He didn't end up that way, but he did begin that way. And progressively over time, he allowed lust to take root in his life that eventually led to adultery and murder. You've got to remember that David had already acquired close to 8, maybe 10 wives before Bathsheba. Okay, obviously, David was not content with being a one man, one woman kind of a man. And he had acquired 2 wives prior to becoming king. Acquired a lot more after becoming king. So this nighttime roof walk that resulted in adultery was not a just David fell off the roof, never lusted before, never had a wrong... No, David had developed a pattern of wrong thinking in his life. Girls are often tempted to think that if the guys would just get their minds out of the gutter, we could get on with this and it wouldn't be such a problem. However, I think this is the wrong reaction. It is true that guys can have their mind in the gutter. But it's also generally true that people don't walk around looking in gutters unless there's something in the gutter that attracts their attention. Okay? And this male attraction to the female physique is a combination of the way God designed the male mind and the presence of something that's visually attractive. So, I say, modesty should therefore be an especially governing check on godly women's clothing. Okay, this relates directly to loving others as ourselves, right? If Christian liberty that we have been given is the freedom to serve others by love, then we're not going to want to do anything that creates a stumbling block to our brother. Since immodesty is clearly a stumbling block over which many men, sorry, spelling mistake, stumble and sin, Christian women cannot love brothers in Christ and dress in a way that is provocative. Modesty in dress promotes pure minds and chaste living. It reduces the opportunity the enemy has to attack others through the lust of the flesh. Only reduces, does not remove. There's no such thing as removal. Okay? Which is why Muslims have it all wrong. Covering up everything doesn't stop a man from lusting. Okay? So that's not the answer. And it also serves as a testimony to the world that God's people are a holy people. And that holiness is what God requires of everyone. Okay? So, I think that's a pretty decent case for why modesty is morally necessary. Next time we're going to look at the biblical components of modesty. What is nakedness? What did the Hebrew coat cover? How can we determine that? And we'll start right here next time. Thank you for your dismissal.